Welcome back. We are about to finish Pax. We will not finish today, but I believe we will tomorrow. So the last thing we read, Pax was with Bristle and Runt. He can sense that Peter's near. So that's all we really knew. And the last thing with Peter, he finally got off the bus. He was traveling through the war zone area, and a soldier stopped him and asked him what he was doing. And the soldier could sympathize with Peter because he had a dog of his own. So he got his picture out, showed him his dog. And he let Peter pass, but he told him to be careful to stay in the woods, not to get caught. All right. Chapter 28. Peter traveled south for almost an hour, feeling certain that Pax had traveled the same route. But when he emerged from the woods, he stopped. A vast meadow sloped down for at least a mile before flattening into another mile of wide green floor. At the base of that, the land rose hundreds of feet in jagged steps, as if chopped with a giant hoe. And beyond that, rolling to the horizon, was the forested plateau that hid the gorge. Since waking, he'd traveled 9 hours without thinking of rest once. But now the stunning immensity of the distance ahead drained what was left of his energy. He dropped his pack and fell to the ground. 9 hours of gripping the crutch handles had stiffened his hands to claws. He forced them open and felt the raw palms split. They blistered the day before, broken open and blistered again. He poured cool water from his thermos over the hot pulp of his palms and set to work picking out shreds of tire rubber. Then he eased his extra pair of socks over his hands and looked out again. A movement halfway down the valley caught his eye. Something trotted in bouncing dips between two trees. Fox movement. Peter rose to his knees. Pax! There it was again. But no, whatever was there was tan, not red. Coyote, maybe. The thought was a shot of adrenaline, and suddenly he was moving again, Pax slamming against his back, crutches pistoning down on the hill all the way to the valley bottom in just half an hour, and then sinking into the boggier ground there, muddy and slower, but still moving. And then a 10-foot sheer rock wall loomed in front of him. The cliffs were a lot taller than they had appeared from across the valley. Before he could second-guess himself, Peter hurled his pack and then his crutches up and heard them clatter onto a stony ledge. He wedged his fingers into a crevice and pulled. His cast scraped along the rough rock face, but his arms were strong from Vola's training. And he levered himself into a shallow foothold. From there, he reached for a jutting tree, then another crack in the rock, and then he heaved himself over the first ledge. It took an hour to climb the stepped rise that way, crutches and pack first and dragging himself after. When he reached the crest, panting and sweat-soaked, he fell to the ground under a tall pine. He drained his thermos in one swallow and ate the last of the ham sandwiches. He opened Vola's second packet. Peanut butter. Peter's throat closed. He remembered the first time Pax had found an empty jar in the trash. He'd squeezed his snout in so deep it had gotten stuck, and Peter had laughed until it hurt. He stuffed the sandwich back into the bag, wishing he'd found it the day before, and tossed it to the dogs scavenging the dumpsters, but got up again. It was almost 6 o'clock, and he still had a ways to go. As he traveled, the memories of those hungry-eyed animals accompanied him, darting and retreating like accusing ghosts. He wished he could tell them that he knew how it felt to have the one person who had loved you and taken care of you suddenly vanish. How the world suddenly seemed dangerous after that. He had lost a parent. How many kids this week, he wondered, had woken up to find their worlds changed that way, their parents gone off to war, maybe never coming home? That was the worst, of course. But what about the smaller losses? How many kids missed their older brothers or sisters for months at a time? How many friends had to say goodbye? How many kids went hungry? How many had to move? How many pets had they had to leave behind to fend for themselves? And why didn't anyone count those things? People should tell the truth about what war costs, Vola had said. Weren't those things the costs of war too? With a start, Peter found that the dark was falling around him. A little panicked, he should have been looking for a good place to settle for the night. He spun around. His left crutch shot out under a patch of loose stones. He fell onto it hard and heard a crisp snap. For an instant he feared rib, but the sound had been wood. He landed, still gripping the top of the crutch, 6 feet away from its bottom shank. Diableman! It came out naturally, a satisfying word. He tried out some other swears, and they felt pretty good, too. But the way the darkening woods absorbed his shouts with a response made him uneasy, so he stopped. He didn't have the luxury of venting anyway. He had a crutch to repair and not much light left. All around him, trees shot out hardwood limbs that he could tape to the broken pieces as a splint. But he had no hatchet to cut them. As he drew the bat out of his pack so he could find the tape, he realized that the solution was in his hand. He aligned the crutch pieces, laid the bat over them, then began winding the tape. When he was finished, he tested the crutch with his full weight. It held, strong and solid. He wished he could tell Vola she'd been right. He had needed her bat on his journey. He knelt by his pack again. The accident had been warning enough. He pulled out the things he needed to make camp for the night, then scraped a bowl in the dirt and filled it with a pile of twigs and dried grass. He touched a match to it, and a little fire crackled to life. Peter held his jackknife over the flames until he figured it was sterilized, then gritted his teeth and split open the new blisters that had formed on his palms. The pain made him gasp, but he eased on some of Vola's salve and took deep breaths until it numbed. The herb smell swept him back to her kitchen with a rush, and he wondered if she was there now. How was she managing without that heavy leg to anchor her? Before he put his knife away, he held it up. The last of the firelight danced along its blade. He remembered the first time he'd seen Vola's knife, how shocked he'd been when she gouged a chip of wood off her leg. Peter tugged up his jeans. He pressed the flat of the knife against his calf and tried to imagine slicing off a nugget of flesh because it offended him, because it wasn't perfect. A coyote howled then, and a second answered from a distance. Peter shivered. He turned the blade until the cool edge creased his flesh, then jerked it up. The slice was only half an inch, but its sting was fierce. There were advantages he could see to being made of wood. The cut beat up. As the dark blood began to drip, he drew it into the shape of a leaping fox. With his fingernail, he picked out a pointed nose, then 2 ears, a wild smear of his thumb for the brush. Pax. Tomorrow. A red fox blood vow. All right, and we are ready to get back into Pax's story, chapter 29. 3 mice swelled Pax's belly, and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. We forgot to talk about that. So Bristle had taught Pax how to hunt, and after he learned that, was he feeling a lot more capable of living in the wild. He was so happy. He was sprinting around and leaping out of trees and really feeling a bit more wild. All right, so I'll start that over. 3 mice swelled Pax's belly, and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. It would feed Bristle and Runt for the whole day. He craved sleep after a long night of hunting, but as usual, he'd trotted a long weaving path home to confuse any possible predators. The trail the bleeding Runt had left when they'd moved was still strong enough to mark them as vulnerable. The first rays of morning light lit the grasses. A movement caught his eye. Bristle. She was a few full bounds out of the clearing, instead of at the apron of the burrow, where she usually guarded Runt. He watched her bounce up in mock alarm, and then tumble kicking into the grass. Then he saw an even more surprising sight. Runt's small head bobbed up. Runt was outside, and he was playing. Pax dropped the muskrat. He called to Bristle, and Runt turned his head. Pax called again, testing. And Runt answered. He could hear. Pax was washed with a relief so overwhelming that he could not move for a moment. Where he had once cared for only one boy, he now brimmed with love for this bristling vixen and her ragged brother, and they were safe. He streaked across the clearing. Bristle and Runt parted to welcome him into the space between them. He dropped onto his back, and Runt toppled onto him. Pax rolled Runt over gently, listening for any whimper of pain, and heard only purrs of delight. For an hour the foxes played. Runt rested often, and whenever he did, the other 2 foxes stopped and flanked him. Like the buttercups beside them, their 3 fox faces lifted to the morning sun. Until Bristle leaped to her feet, her nostrils flared. Pax smelled it too, the same threatening scent that had made him anxious for 2 days. But this was no longer a faint threat in the air. This odor was strong and growing stronger. Coyote. Bristle jumped toward the den, pivoting toward the clearing, then jumped back to run. Pax had never seen her so panicked. At that instant, all three foxes perked their ears sharply to the same spot in the woods. To the careless branch rustling of a creature that did not need the advantage of stealth, heading north up from the gorge, heading for the clearing. The coyote was following Runt's trail. Bristle nosed her brother upright and screamed at Pax, "Guard him!" Pax herded Runt back into the den. Pacing the entrance, he watched Bristle head toward the rustling, stiff-legged and wary, and then stop. She pricked her ears, her rump high. And then in front of her, at the precise place where the junipers were still compressed from dragging Runt in, a dark brindle coyote emerged, his head to the ground. Bristle barked. The coyote's head snapped up. Bristle barked again and jumped into the clearing. The coyote cocked his head and took a step toward her. Then he lowered his nose to Runt's trail again. Deep instinct urged Pax to run away. The coyote was a tall, heavily muscled male. A fox was no match for an animal that large and aggressive. But a deeper instinct reminded him that Runt was defenseless in the burrow. Bristle ignored the instinct to flee as well. Instead, she tore straight toward the coyote, lunging at his flank. The coyote spun and snapped, just clipping Bristle's back foot. She limped into the clearing, whining as if she'd been injured. The coyote studied her, but then he shook himself, recognizing the ploy, and dropped to the scent again. Bristle flew back. She jumped in front of the coyote's path and faced him, her spine arched. From her throat came a hoarse howl Pax had never heard before. For an instant, the coyote pulled back, seeming surprised that the small fox was engaging him. Then he bunched his shoulders into attack position and bared his teeth. Pax's body stiffened. A growl rattled in his throat. Runt whimpered in the den. The coyote sprang at Bristle and knocked her to the ground. For a moment, Pax saw nothing but fur and teeth flashing in the grass and heard only yips and growls. But then Bristle scrambled out of the coyote's hold. She leaped again toward the center of the clearing, a single leap only. Pax understood that she was luring him away from Runt. Staying just out of his reach, she baited the coyote until she reached the sweet gum tree. Then, just as Pax had done, she leaped up onto the slant of the trunk. She padded out onto the low first branch carefully, never taking her eyes off the growling coyote who followed on the ground. When she reached the spot where the branch split, she was well over his head. She hissed a taunt. The coyote jumped. He clawed only bark and leaves. He circled in the hollow under the branch, looking for higher ground, and then jumped again. This time his forepaw caught the branch and held for an instant before he fell back. He gathered himself and leaped again. Pax saw that Bristle was as far out on the limb as she could go. The coyote would tear her from the tree soon, or grow impatient with her distractions and return to the trail she'd diverted him from. She would follow and fight until he ripped her apart. "Stay," Pax ordered Runt, and he tore across the clearing. And that is where we will end today. Actually, wait, nope, one more chapter, I'm sorry. One more chapter. Chapter 30. Peter stared. There'd been a birch tree by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the Pirate Tree because in the fall, bright yellow leaves made it look like it was covered in gold coins. He'd tied Pax to its trunk once when the kit hadn't liked their warplay. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else except the mill itself was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted to splintered logs. Great patches of grasses around them were scorched to ash. The bank was littered with the crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most to look at was the water. The last time he'd been here, he'd dived into the pool at the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling and clear that he'd been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales of the trout, and even, when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonfly wings skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. So there's a metaphor. Now muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The flat broad of the river was half its usual breadth. Mudflats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. The right side, he'd added indignantly. Boy, Vola had said, and then boy, again to make sure she had his attention. Do you think anyone in the history of this world ever set out to fight for the wrong side? Think about that. When two sides go to war, don't both sides feel justified that they are correct? That's true. So that's part of what makes war so difficult. Both sides feel they are correct. The wind picked up and howled across the field, stirring eddies of ash. Peter tried to imagine playing there again. It would be a long time before anyone would ever want to play there. Vultures wheeling silently above him were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were circling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal he had interrupted. A meal that might be... Peter couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been there, he could be dead by now. And if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. They hovered over 3 distinct spots. The one beside him and 2 across the river, slow and lazy, in no hurry. Their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack. Freed of the weight, he swung down to the hemlock bough in only a few steps. Trailing from beneath it was the sight he was dreading. A foxtail. Its white-tipped brush unmistakable. He lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt remained, and it wasn't red. It wasn't red. Not Pax. He took a ragged breath. Dizzy with relief, he pegged down to the river and waded in. When he was waist-high, the crutches skidded out on the mud-slimed stones, so he speared them over to the far bank and dived in. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank. Out of the water, the soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and hacked at it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw what the larger group of vultures was circling, the corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he'd seen in Vola's field. You humans, you ruin everything. And turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the 3rd spot he'd sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first there seemed to be nothing on the charred ground, but when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg, fleshless and singed, but he still knew it was a hind leg. A slim, back-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift at the fur at the top was bright crimson. Fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Wasn't it too small to be Pax's? He wished he could know, and then he took back the wish. What did it matter anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some humans had obliterated that life. Wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. Peter dropped to the ground. He swept a circle bare of rubble, and his hand brushed something that turned the breath in his lungs to ash. A toy soldier, sighting down the barrel of a rifle pressed tight to its green hard cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter kneeled over. Pax! And that is where we will stop today. All right, so we will finish the story next time. I hope you've all enjoyed it so far. If you have any comments or predictions or questions, please feel free to email me. Have a wonderful day.